Welcome to Gemara Academy. In this class, we will learn Tesis Dibra Maschel, Hokamashmalon Karav Chulu. Let's begin by looking at the flowchart of the Gemara so we can see what Tesis is coming to explain. So here in the Gemara, we presented the teaching of Isi ben Yehuda. And originally we thought that what Isi ben Yehuda is saying is that if a person did all the malachas on Shabbos, all 39, he's only chayav one thing. However, in the conclusion we explained that what Isi ben Yehuda is saying is that a person's chayav for all the malachas except for one. So originally we thought he's saying that if a person did all of them, he's only chayav one thing. And at the end we said a person's chayav for all of them, each and every one of them, except for one. So this is the part of the Gemara that Tosfos is coming to explain and talk about. Let's see the general outline of Tosfos. So in the Gemara we discussed what was the nature of the teaching of Isi. We had the way we understood it originally and the way we concluded that a person's chayav for all the malachas except for one of them. So there's three parts to Tosfos. Number one is Tosfos will explain and prove that Isi is referring to skila. And the final understanding what the teaching of Isi actually is, that a person's chayav for all the malachas, for each one of them, except for one, it means to say he's chayav for each of them skila, except for one of them, where there he's not chayav skila. It's not referring to a carbon chatas. Second part of Tosfos is Tosfos will explain and prove that originally we understood that Isi was talking about a carbon chatas. In our original understanding of the teaching of Isi, that if a person did all the malachas, he's only chayav one thing, there we understood that he's referring to a carbon chatas. So this is really breaks down the whole Tosfos, which is a contrast of the way we understood Isi originally and what we concluded. It's not just the difference in what he taught, but also what he's referring to. Originally, when he said a person's chayav, if he did all the malachas, only one thing, it means he's chayav one carbon chatas. And at the end, when we said a person's chayav for each of them, except for one, it means to say that there he's not chayav skila. So what changes is not just the teaching, but also whether it's referring to a carbon chatas or to skila. And the last part of Tosfos is Tosfos will address a question from a Gemara elsewhere on Isi, on this teaching of Isi, that a person's chayav for each of the malachas skila, except for one. Tosfos will address a question from a Gemara elsewhere on this teaching. So let's see Tosfos now in the flowchart form. So we brought down a teaching from Isi ben Yehuda and determined that he holds that for one of the malachas a person isn't chayav. So Tosfos brings down from the Re points out that Isi only holds that a person isn't chayav skila for that malacha, but he is chayav a carbon chatas. That means when he says that a person's chayav for each of the malachas, except for one of them, he's referring to skila. However, carbon chatas, there is no exception. A person's chayav for all 39 malachas to bring a carbon chatas. So this is the teaching of the Re, and what's his proof from the Gemara? His proof is, because if it's referring even to a carbon chatas, that even in carbon chatas a person is not chayiv for one malacha, then when the Gemara asked b'shegig chayiv chatas pshita, he should have answered hokamash malon karav. Originally, when the Gemara asked, why does the Tan of the Brisa need to teach us that if a person carried b'shegig, he's chayiv a carbon chatas? It's obvious. Of course, he's chayiv a carbon chatas. The Gemara should have answered immediately. It's not obvious. Hokamash malon karav. The way Rav understood and interpreted the teaching of Isi, it comes out that it wasn't obvious at all. Because Isi teaches that a person's chayav for all the malachas except for one. If we understand that it's referring to a carbon chatas, we have a chiddush over here. That even though there's one malacha that a person's not chayav a carbon chatas for, the Tan of the Brisa tells us that for Hitzah a person is chayav a carbon chatas. This is not the case. Hitzah is not the malacha that Isi was referring to. So there is a chiddush. And Tosfos concludes, since his answer that we needed for Mezid doesn't answer anything. What the Gemara actually answers is, when the Gemara asked, B'shegig chayav chatas is obvious, the Gemara said, well, we needed for Mezid. That didn't answer our question. If anything, it tells us, you're right. We don't need to teach you that B'shegig is chayav a carbon chatas. It's obvious. Because for all malachas, a person's chayav a carbon chatas. However, we needed for Mezid, because by Mezid there's a chiddush. And the chiddush is, like we conclude, that even though there's one malacha, that a person's not chayav when he does it by Mezid skila, the Tana of our Brisa is telling us that Eitzah is not that one. So here what Tosfos brings down from the Re is that in the final understanding of the teaching of Isi ben Yehuda, his teaching that a person's chayav for all the malachas except for one, we're talking about skila. Tosfos over here proves it, not in the context of we could prove it from Isi himself, but we prove it that that's how the Gemara that's what the Gemara understood. Now, how does the Gemara know that? We'll see in a moment. But Tosfos is just pointing out over here, clearly that's how the Gemara understood it, because when the Gemara originally asked, B'shegig chayav chatas is obvious, the Gemara didn't answer, no, it's not obvious, because there's one malacha that a person's not chayav a carbon chatas for. Rather, when the Gemara said, well, b'mezid is also obvious that he's chayav skil, the Gemara said, no, it's not obvious. And the way we understand it is because there's one malacha that a person is not chayav skila for, and that's why it's not obvious when we say that this one is chayav skila. It's teaching us something. This is not the exception. So here Tosfos basically proof from the Gemara that the Gemara clearly understood that Isi is talking about skila. Now Tosfos continues and contrast this to what we thought originally. And it says, originally we certainly didn't know it was only referring to skila. Originally, when we presented the teaching of Isi ben Yehuda, that if a person did all the malachas, he's only chayav one, then we didn't think it was talking about skila. And Tosfos explains, as we see that he asks from Rabbi Yechanan, who talks about achatas. If we thought he was talking about skila, then what was our question? How could Isi say that if a person did all the malachas, he's only chayav skila once? But Rabbi Yechanan said he's chayav 39 chatos. What's the question? Rabbi Yechanan is talking about chatas, Isi is talking about skila. So clearly the Gemara originally did not interpret that Isi was talking about skila, he was talking about a carbon chatas. And why did the Gemara do this? Okay, the Gemara asked from Rabbi Yechanan, indicating that the Gemara understood that Isi was talking about a carbon chatas, so we have a question. How can he say you're only chayav one? Rabbi Yechanan said he's chayav 39. But how did the Gemara know that Isi was talking about a carbon chatas? So Tosfos explains it simply, because we can't say he's only chayav one refers to skila. We can't say when Isi said a person's only chayav one, even if he did all 39 malachas, it means one skila. That can't be what he's teaching, because a person can't be killed twice. Of course, if a person did it b'mezid, he's only going to be killed once. So Isi wouldn't need to teach that. He wouldn't tell us if a person had 39 malachas, you should know he doesn't get killed 39 times, he only gets killed once. That we don't need a teaching from Isi for that. So obviously what Isi is referring to is a carbon chatas. So here Tosfos showed us in the context of the Gemara and logic that we see that the Gemara understood Isi is talking about a carbon chatas. That's why we asked from Rabbi Yechanan. And we could also understand why the Gemara said that. Because Isi would only make sense at that point to be talking about a carbon chatas. It would make no sense that he's talking about skila, that a person only gets killed once. Now Tosfos continues, and over here he shows us why at the end the Gemara understands that Isi is talking about skila. We showed that the Gemara understood that he's talking about skila, but why did the Gemara say that? So that's going to come out now in the last part of this point. But when we explain he's not chayav for one of them, in the conclusion that the teaching of Isi is not that for all of them he's only chayav one, but rather he's chayav for all of them except for one. So, but when we explain he's not chayav for one of them, then we knew that it's referring to skila, since we don't want to say he's arguing with the Mishnah and Paraklal Gadol. The reason why the Gemara says and understands and interprets that when Isi says he's chayav for all of them except for one, to be referring to skila, because if it's referring to a carbon chatas, then he's arguing in the Mishnah and Paraklal Gadol. The Mishnah and Paraklal Gadol says there are 39 of us malachas. It tells us the number in order to let us know that a person's chayav for 39 chatos. If we're going to say that Isi teaches a person's chayav for all of them except for one, it comes out he's arguing on the Mishnah and Paraklal Gadol. The Gemara doesn't want to say that, and that's why we interpret that Isi is referring to skila. He's chayav for all of them skila except for one. However, carbon chatas, he's chayav for all of them, and there are no exceptions. And this is really the entirety and totality of Tosfos, which is to bring out the contrast between originally what we thought is the teaching of Isi, and at the end what we determined is the teaching of Isi. And that originally our understanding of Isi was referring to a carbon chatas. It would make no sense for him to say he's teaching about skila, that a person only gets killed once. And in the conclusion, we determined that he's talking about skila, that for all the malachas, a person's chayav skila, except for one of them. The reason we learn it that way is because we don't want that he should be arguing on the Mishnah and Paraklal Gadol. Now Tosfos continues with a few more points. Says Tosfos, now we can understand that the Gemara explains the case of Rabbi Yechanan is that he knew about Chumen and it will fit with Rabbi Akiva. The Gemara in Paraklal Gadol asks, what does it mean that the person is chayav 39 chatos if he did 39 malachas? How could it be that a person is aware that it's Shabbos and doesn't know that these things are malachas? In other words, if the person didn't know it was Shabbos, then there's one shaygig. He didn't know it was Shabbos. He should have to bring one carbon chatas. In order for a person to be chayav 39 chatos, we have to explain that he knew it was Shabbos. He knew it was Shabbos on a level of the Torah, that the Torah created this day of Shabbos, and there's some significance to the day. He just didn't know there were 39 malachas. So in what was reflected is awareness that the day was Shabbos. What does Shabbos mean? So the Gemara answers that teaching, that the person's chayav 39 chatos, fits with Rabbi Akiva, who says Tchumen is menatera. In other words, the person knew it was Shabbos. He thought what Shabbos is a day that a person has to rest. He can't go out of the Tchum. And that's menatera according to Rabbi Akiva. So he was aware on a Torah level that there's some significance to the day in halacha, that it's Shabbos. It's Shabbos, it can't go out of the Tchum. The person didn't know that there was an additional 39 malachas. So that's how the Gemara interprets over there the scenario that a person will be chayav 39 chatos. Says Tosfos, now we can understand, now that we say that the teaching of Isi is about skila and not a carbon chatas, we can understand why the Gemara said that, and it didn't say he knew of the case of Isi. The Gemara didn't say, well, the way it's possible is, since Isi taught, if we were to learn Isi is referring to a carbon chatas, that a person's chayav for all the malachas of carbon chatas except for one, the way it's possible that a person will be chayav the maximum number of chatos, it wouldn't come out 39, and this is addressed by Mefarshim. So we'll just say the way a person's chayav the maximum number of chatos is if he knew about the one malacha, which a person is not chayav a carbon chatas for, he didn't know about all the others. That's a way that a person can be chayav the maximum number of chatayis, which doesn't come out to be 39, it comes out to be 38, but it's the maximum number of chatayis, because for this one, a person is not chayav a carbon chatas. Now we understand why the Gemara didn't say that, because he's chayav a chatas for everything. The way we're learning now is that a person is chayav a chatas for all the malachas. The only exception is regarding skila, and that's why the Gemara doesn't answer that it'll fit with isi, that the understanding of that Mishnah is that the person knew the one malacha that he's not chayav a carbon chatas for, and the other 38 he knew. We'll just point out over here that it seems like a internal contradiction in Tosfos that we just pointed out earlier, that the Mishnah in Perek Al Gadol will not fit with isi if isi says there's one case he's not chayav a carbon chatas for, because then it comes out that according to isi there's only 38 chatayis, and the Mishnah in Perek Al Gadol says 39, and now a moment later Tosfos says that if isi is referring to a carbon chatas, then we could say that that Mishnah fits with isi, and he's chayav 39 chatayis. Well, it's not actually 39; it's 38. It's the maximum number, and he knew one. He knew the one that one is not chayav chatas for. So it seems like an internal contradiction that's addressed in Mefarshim. Tosfos now continues and brings out another point. He says three things in a way he's proving and supporting his understanding of Ri, that isi is talking about skila. Number one, Rashi also learns it this way, that when isi says a person's chayav for all of the malachas except for one, it means he's chayav for all of them skila except for one. Number two, Tosfos says, and in Perek HaZerik we also mention isi by skila. Also later on the Gemara in Perek HaZerik mentions it explicitly by skila, because our Gemara doesn't say explicitly skila, we just proved it from the Gemara and explained it and supported it. Tosfos says the Gemara in Perek HaZerik says it explicitly. And number three, and we don't find it said anywhere by a chatas. So Tosfos is bringing out that this understanding of isi is supported by Rashi, the Gemara in Perek HaZerik, and the fact that there's a lack of anywhere being interpreted that it's talking about a carbon chatas. So when isi says a person's chayav for all of them except for one, he means he's chayav for all of them, the punishment of skila, except for one malacha a person is not chayav skila for. And the last and final part of Tosfos says he addresses a question on this interpretation. And this that we say later, according to Rami Bar Chama, that the Brisa says if a person is chayav a chatas, he is chayav skila. There's later on a Brisa that is brought down and it's used to challenge Rami Bar Chama about opinions of his elsewhere. The bottom line that we're bringing out over here is that the Gemara interprets the Brisa according to Rami Bar Chama that it's saying that if a person is chayav a chatas, he is chayav skila. So this seems to contradict isi, because we have a case where he's chayav chatas and not chayav skila, because isi teaches that for all the cases a person's chayav skila except for one. That means in that one case he's chayav a carbon chatas and he's not chayav skila. The way we interpreted the Brisa over there is if he's chayav chatas, he's going to be chayav skila. Says Tosfos simply, Riva says this doesn't fit with isi. The way Rami Bar Chama will understand the Brisa won't fit with isi. However, we can understand the Brisa in a different way. And also this is discussed in the Maram, in the Mefarshim, how to learn that Brisa that it should fit with isi. At any rate, just to summarize the Tosfos, what Tosfos really points out over here is that originally when we understood that the teaching of isi was that if a person did all the malachas, he's only chayav one, it's referring to that he's chayav one carbon chatas. And Tosfos proved that we have to say that we understood it this way. And in the conclusion, when we determine that the teaching of isi is that if a person did all the malachas, he's going to be chayav, except for one, it has to be talking about that if he did all the malachas, he's going to be chayav skila, except for one malacha where he won't be chayav skila. Tosfos showed us why we have to say this. It's the only way to understand and make sense of the teaching of isi, because we don't want it to contradict the Mishnah in Perek Al Gadol, and also showed us how that's clearly how the Gemara understood it, based on that the Gemara only answered and brought isi when we mentioned mezid. It did not bring isi when we mentioned that being chayav a carbon chatas b'shegig is obvious. And with that, we basically have the entirety of Tosfos with a couple of side points.